Okay. Hi, everyone. So we are here from Endless Studios today, and we are going to be running our first Careers in Games talk. This specifically is the Game Design Careers talk. I'm Jack here from Endless Studios, and with us today we have four guests who are all going to talk about what it's like to work in the games industry. And we have a bunch of questions written out for all of them that we're going to be asking today, but you watching can also ask your own questions in the chat. So feel free, if you have questions throughout any point in the stream, to ask in the chat, and we will make sure that those go live for you. Without further ado, let's get some quick introductions, everyone. So who are we today? Let's talk.
Well, I'll go ahead and start and say that I am Tyler Crumrine. I am the designer behind Possible Worlds Games, a tabletop role-playing game company here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And I am a one-man studio. So I design and publish games from concept all the way up through play testing to even pricing the paper and ordering print runs, fulfilling orders, things like that, all on my lonesome. So I have a lot of perspective for what goes into being a solo creative in the tabletop role-playing space, but also tabletop games in general. And in addition to my work as a designer and publisher, I also teach game design at Carnegie Mellon University. So I'm excited to be here and to answer some questions today.
Hey everybody, my name is Benjamin Bello. I'm a freelance narrative designer, currently working with an interactive fiction app named Zori. There I basically do, I basically help take authored books that already exist in the market, and I help to make them more interactive, applying choices for readers to, like adventure style read through the books and change up certain scenes or have certain different endings depending on your path through the book. A lot of my previous work has also been along the same lines. So with narrative design, it's a lot of combining my love for writing with my love for game design. So I've created my own visual novels in the past. I've worked on small scale tabletop RPGs. And previously, I also worked with EA, working on a mobile game that was themed around Lord of the Rings. So a lot of research and a lot of reading that goes into that kind of stuff. But yeah, fundamentally speaking, a lot of writing and design is my focus.
All right. Hey everyone, I'm Nick Phipps. I'm the senior game designer here at Ubisoft Abu Dhabi in the Middle East. I've been doing mobile games here for the last 10 years. And in that time, I've done games such as NCIS and CSI. And I've also, for the last 6 or 7 years, been running a game called Growtopia, which is a massive multiplayer game on the mobile devices. And it's also been on all the other devices. It's on Switch. It was on Switch, Xbox, PlayStation, PC, and all of the other things. And in that time, I've pretty much been doing regular releases on about every 2 weeks. So yeah, that's what I do.
I'm Greg Trefry. Excuse me. I'm Greg Trefry from Gigantic Mechanic. I'm a game designer here, and we do a wide mixture of stuff, everything from some video games and mobile games to games for museums, some live action. There was. Oh, sorry. That was based on, so it's a set of historical role plays that teachers can use in high school classrooms. And it's based on some work we did with some museums up in Boston a couple years ago. And yeah, I also teach game design at NYU and have done, before Gigantic Mechanic, I had a studio, or I worked at a game lab doing casual game development.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today. Let's get started with our first question. We're going to be jumping in with something that is less about careers in game design and more just about games, because it's important as a designer to also keep your finger on the pulse of the industry. And that's the best way of making an excuse to play games in addition to also making them. So what have you all been playing recently? What have you been wanting to play? Is there anything that you've had your eye on recently?
I'm happy to go first. I've been playing Dredge because I I was seeing a lot of buzz around it within the indie game sphere, and also that I know that it got a lot of popularity recently. If I'm not mistaken, I think it showed up in the Game Awards. So I'm not somebody who is super into anything scary at all. I scare very easily, unfortunately. So I was avoiding it on purpose. I was like, no, I'm good. But then seeing how much praise it's gotten, I've been more and more interested, and I was like, okay, fine, I guess I'll finally try it. It's been really interesting. I think it's the simplicity of like both the mechanics and the world and the story all kind of combined together to like have a game that's worth a lot more than the individual parts, I think, or at least in my own personal experience. I am scared at all times, though. Yeah, that hasn't changed.
I'll go ahead and say that two things I've played recently. One, I mean, as I think all of us can say, is like video game or tabletop game designers, any end of the industry, you always wish you had more time to play games because there's just so much good stuff out there, and it's so hard to find time for everything. I will say there's a role-playing game I played recently called Price of Coal, which is a card-based role-playing game that talks about coal miner rebellions here in Appalachia that I really enjoyed as like a very fun and also like educational in a way of like, oh, it's fun learning about people, not like knowledge being crammed into your brain type of thing. And I've also been playing a short little roguelite called Undermine on my Switch because as someone who is self-employed, a lot of my daily struggle is staying motivated to get work done. And so having a game that I can play like an arcade style run between various different tasks is enough to kind of like shake the dust off my brain as I go from like, okay, it's writing time to it's post office time.
Yeah. On my side, I always bounce around between maybe 10 or 20 games on the mobile side. But there's a couple of that I've been playing recently. One of the interesting ones is Pocket Quest, which is a little game where it automatically runs a little character around a loop, and you slowly build up a world, making it more difficult for your player, but also giving them more experience and more items. So that's a really interesting one. I don't know if anyone knows Loop Heroes, but it's a mobile casual version of that game. And another one that's more recent that's come out is King or Fail. So that's another little, just a collection game where you go and harvest trees and wood and rocks and stuff and build up your castle and slowly battle against other castles.
Nice. I played laser tag the other day, which was awesome. And I totally got my butt kicked by my kids. I've also been bowling a lot lately because my son was on a bowling team, and so we went bowling with him a lot, which was totally fascinating. And
Greg, we got a little Wi-Fi issue there. Laser tag and bowling are both great. Great. Anything you want to add after bowling?
No. And I played Cards Against Humanity, the family version the other day, which I assumed was just apples to apples, but was slightly different.
Yeah, it sounds like just about. With that said, let's jump into starting out, right? We talked a lot about the games that we all like, but those all were made by people like all of you here. So let's talk about how the people watching this can become people like all of you and work in the kind of fields that you do. So we're going to start with advice on getting into design and getting into game making in general. First question that we have on that front is, what parts of game making did you struggle with the most when you started out? So that could be literally, well, this is a very difficult skill to learn. It could also be in a wider lens. Oh, well, there's a lot of brainstorming that goes into stuff, all these different things. I'll let all of you answer that. But yeah, what did you struggle with the most when you started out?
I'll say that the first thing that I had to overcome when I started designing games is just perception of like what a real game is, or I guess scope. Especially if you think tabletop role-playing games, you probably think Dungeons and Dragons, which is a big hardcover book, hundreds of pages. And it's very easy when you have like a desire to make role-playing games to be like, well, if I want to be a real role-playing game designer, that's what I need to make. I need to write a 300-page book, and I need to have I need to have mechanics for how much weight a horse can carry, because like a real game is one that like thinks of every possibility and that overwhelms players with just how like much of a world there is. But the fact of the matter is that D&D not only has been iterated on for, decades now, but has a huge team of people that all work together to make those kinds of games. As an indie developer, and as someone who is making games on their own, or maybe it's you and an illustrator working on something, it's really hard to have that pie in the sky ambition of like, well, I will be validated if I hit the 300 pages and make this. When a lot of times it's easier and more rewarding to make a short game that is 10 pages, 30 pages. A lot of the games that my students make in class are intentionally one-page games where it's like, all right, how much of a game can I make on the front and back of a standard piece of paper? Because when you make a smaller game, not only do you have a better chance of finishing it, but you're able to get to the next step in the learning process, which is actually playing that game with people and seeing what works and what doesn't. And just like a novel will never be finished if you never get to the last page and let people actually read it, a game will never feel like it's, your own until you actually get it in front of players. So learning to like check my own expectations and just like enjoy making small things well was really my first step in actually being able to release games.
Yeah, I can jump in next there. For me, one of the most difficult things was documentation for games, because it's one thing to have an idea, but it's a completely other thing to put it into words or put it onto paper in a way that somebody else can understand your idea, and understanding how much you need to put in to have all the information in there, while at the same time not putting too much in there so that people miss important details because there's just too much information. And on my side, I didn't mention it, but I dropped out of school in primary school. So for me, the writing side of documentation has always been a struggle. So that's one thing that I have always found tricky, but at the same time, it's a fun challenge because you're always trying to figure out how to communicate all of the information you want in as succinct and short amount of words, using images or any kind of way that you can to convey the information you need to the people that need to know that information. So yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm also along those similar lines where on that same thought of needing to share the information about what your idea is to people concisely. There's also playtesting was a big one that took me a while to get into and to really not to see the value, because of course I can understand like where the value could come from somebody telling you, hey, like here's what's wrong with your game. Super important to get, but you'll get a lot of feedback from a lot of people. And on top of that, you will also get a lot of feedback that may not necessarily align with what your initial idea was. Like you'll have a game where it's either supposed to be something really short, really simple, doing one concrete idea, and then you'll have an idea that from somebody which could be good, and they're telling you, hey, this is super interesting. I think what you should really do is really expand it to this direction instead. Or actually, I think the fundamental idea here is not really working out so well, but I think if you did this instead, it could honestly be like what you need. And being able to parse through ideas and see what's worth and what's not worth keeping, especially in terms of like what's within your scope, what can you and your team actually accomplish. It's been difficult. I've worked on several games where my own thoughts and my own beliefs for what the game was trying to accomplish even clash with people within my own team, and then eventually you have to have all the discussions there where you're just like, okay, wait, hold on, what are we trying to make? Let's figure out, like, let me just double check because this is where I was at. So it's a lot of communication, a lot of expectation setting, and a lot of figuring out like what is right and what's wrong for your particular product, I guess.
Yeah, I'd say on my end, it's always understanding the audience, like kind of on the playtesting end of things, like understanding who your audience is and how, because we've worked in a bunch of different domains in making games for different types of folks. And so oftentimes you think like, I'm going to make this game and everyone's going to love it. And then you kind of over time realize like, I know I should focus.
Greg, we got a little bit of a Wi-Fi blip there. Can you start again with over time?
Oh yeah, I mean over time. Yeah, for us over time, like thinking about like who the audience is, like who like what they what they want to play, and oftentimes you think I'm going to make a game that everyone wants to play, but that's never true. You kind of got to focus in on your audience a little bit more. And so understanding that process, like modeling them and modeling that audience was really important and always a tough thing to do.
Yeah. Great round of answers, and I think it segues us into the next question pretty well. We've already touched on this one briefly, but I still think it's important to ask because we have a lot of first-time students in our chat. What do you think is a good first project for aspiring designers? So it doesn't need to be an entire game, but just a first project.
I think one of the first things that I did was a clone. So taking usually a small, ideally older game, because it's typically have more concrete ideas that they're playing with in terms of mechanics, that not too overly complex. Taking something like Frogger, for example, and just saying, okay, like what exactly makes Frogger? Like, how did I get the frogs to go across the street? Like, how do I get cars to spawn and then despawn across the arena, and then like keep making that happen without the memory blanking out in my game? Figuring out like how all that backend stuff starts to work out when you're making something really small, I think helps eventually when you're starting to work on bigger and bigger projects. You understand like, oh, okay, like again, when it comes to scope, you're like, okay, actually, this would take a long time to work on. It's better to try to figure out how else we can either go about maybe like creating the same effect without actually having to create it, or maybe we have to let go of this feature or stuff like that.
Yeah, I'd probably build on that and go even smaller than making a full game. You mentioned about making an old, smaller game, but I would go down to even making a single feature. So trying to copy one thing in a game that you like and trying to get it as close as you can. So, for example, like taking maybe even just a health bar or a button from a game that you like and trying to make that, and then going on and trying to make one other feature from another game. And if you do that a couple of times, before too long, you'll have a bunch of features that you can plug in together and make your own thing. And you'll have also been able to dig through and learn how to analyze one specific feature and all of the bits and pieces that go into even something as simple as a button or a health bar on the screen. And so that'll give you a better understanding of when you write down, I want to have a health bar, you're not just having like, oh, I played a game and it has a health bar, that's easy. You have a bit more of an understanding of all of the little bits and pieces that go into even something that might look simple. Yeah.
I'll say that when you're designing for tabletop role-playing games, like it's a very similar starting point to both of those. A lot of times people start designing as game masters before they even realize they're doing it. Like if you're playing a game and someone is like, oh, well, I rolled this die and I failed. Like I'm trying to pick up this heavy box and I failed on my roll, but hey, I have this box lifting equipment. Is it okay if I re-roll? A GM saying like, yeah, you know, within the context, it makes sense. Yeah, roll a second time or roll with advantage. Or maybe someone saying like, all right, for this, we're going to have a coin flip. Or maybe someone puts a candle on the table and they're like, all right, you have to get through this dungeon before the candle burns out. Little things like that, little additions to games you're already playing and different ways that you run the games can be, you know, first elements of design. You know, as you think about, all right, what changes do I make to this game to make it fit my players better? Maybe those are things that you want to be core tenets of a game of yours in the future. And similar to kind of copying or iterating on other games, there's something in indie role-playing games especially called an SRD, or a system reference document. So if you go to itch, like scratching an itch.io, and search their physical games tab for SRD, you're going to find a lot of people who took kind of just the baseline system, just the way that dice work or, you know, the way characters are created, and they've made them available at an open license for people to iterate on, to make their own games with, to take the mechanics and maybe make like a sci-fi version or, you know, a like cartoon version. You know, a lot of times a great place to start with designing a tabletop game is hacking a system or reskinning a system that someone else has already found like the probability curves on, and you can just focus on the flavor.
Yeah, I mean, I think modding is always a good place to start. And the first thing I did when I was the first game I worked on professionally was just doing level design. I think that's another great place to start. Like, find a game that allows you to mess with the levels, and because
Unfortunately, Jack, you were muted just then.
Yes.
Greg was just saying find a level is where we caught you last.
yeah, find a game that allows you to mess with the levels and do that. It really makes you dig into the experience design over and over again and try out different ideas.
Yeah. Well, speaking of getting started, speaking of really finding places, let's talk about finding your place in the industry and getting started in the industry. There are a lot of different ways we can do that. I think everyone here has a bit of a different way that they got their first start. So let's talk about that a little bit. Let me actually rephrase that. How did you all get your start in the industry? What would you say was your first big jump into actually making games? Because we have the first projects that we work on, and then we have the first projects we work on professionally. So what do you think led you to taking on this project professionally? How did you get started?
Before I worked in games, I actually worked in theater and poetry. I have an English major. I don't have a game design degree, but I was doing editorial work. And I was also playing a lot of games. I was a member of different Discords that were dedicated to tabletop games, things like that. I had been doing a little bit of hobbyist design of my own on the side and just sharing it with friends and like peers in those communities. But because I had skills as a literary editor, you know, tabletop role-playing games at the end of the day are books. and they need people to check them for typos. They need people to, make sure that the grammar is correct, etc. And so my first professional gig was a friend of mine who similarly got his first professional gig way back when, was doing a small project and said, Tyler, there are a lot of people in the game space that know design and mechanics really well, but not nearly as many people who know just what makes a good sentence. Would you, for a per word rate, be an editor on this project? So I did that game with him. I did a number of other games with that person, started working with other people. And then when I was ready to take my first game and put it forward for release, I did a Kickstarter for my first RPG. I had a network of people that, knew me, knew my work, and that were, the first to hit retweet to share with all of their fans the work that I had done, and the work that I would be doing, like a vote of confidence. So even if your first gig isn't well, and here's my creative child fully formed, even skills that you have right now as an editor, as an illustrator, as, a playtester, a project manager, there are all different kinds of ways that you can get to know a project, get to know a team, start relationships with collaborators, even just on hobbyist projects. And then when you have an idea that your teeth will fall out if you don't share it with someone, you'll be that much more prepared to do it. And you'll also have a support team behind you already, whether they're working with you hand in hand or just excited to share the news.
Yeah, not similar. I had a very different, I think, path to where I got. I had always sort of known that I'd always wanted to do game design to some sort of degree when I was younger, and everything I did, I angled towards that goal. So eventually, when I was applying for colleges, I was looking around for game design programs, and I was able to eventually get into NYU. And NYU has a wonderful program called the Game Center, where they do a bachelor's and a master's of arts within game design. So I went through that whole college-led education process, trying to get foundational skills, which is where actually I learned that I really didn't like programming. I was very bad at it, which is where I started to then transition more into my narrative-focused game design career. Obviously, I think the similarities you're going to find is that it's all about building that initial community. So going to college and meeting so many like-minded people, I was able to find so many peers who wanted to also make games, obviously, but also make games that I was interested in as well. And I found a group of people towards my senior year, and we created our capstone project, which was a small visual novel within the realm of 20 to 30 minutes that really digged into the things that I love to do. I loved, obviously, writing, loved designing for conversations and figuring out how do you make people care about and be engaged with characters on the screen. And off the success of that, I was able to then leverage that game, which got a small amount of acclaim. I got a little bit of a little article written about the game Kotaku, which was super nice. And from there, I was able to, start reaching out to bigger studios and start saying, hey, here's some skills that I have, demonstrable, marketable skills that I've been able to share with other people. And that led me to an interview and eventually to my my job at EA for a 1-year contract. So that's my professional route.
Yeah, my side was essentially the complete opposite of Ben. Yeah. I mentioned before that I dropped out of school very, very early. I spent about 10 years bouncing around all sorts of different industries, from warehousing to being a cook to doing sound technician work, doing sign writing. I did all sorts of things before ever getting into game design in any form of official work. But in my childhood growing up, my dad was a programmer working out of our kitchen table. So I grew up discussing all of the challenges and all of the logic puzzles that go into programming, and just doing the general work of figuring out how something works and how it doesn't work. on a day-to-day basis. And I also started modding my own games early on with Baldur's Gate, the original Baldur's Gate back in the day, and doing maps for StarCraft and things like that. But as far as actually getting into the industry, later on, I ended up finding a game design course that I liked the look of and started studying game design on the side while I was working. So I was working full-time managing a warehouse at the time and doing a game design course on the side. And then in that game design course, one of my lecturers was working on another course here in Abu Dhabi. So I got connections through the lecturers at the university that I was at to come here to the Middle East, and it had quite a good opportunity to get a job out of that. So I dropped the course that I was working on halfway through, stopped doing the course, started another very similar course here in Abu Dhabi because there was a much better chance of getting a job out of that after I finished the course. And then after that, I got an internship here at Ubisoft, and I've been here ever since. So I literally dropped everything I had in Australia, sold my house, and flew to the other side of the world with the hope that after I finished the course, I might get a job. So yeah, it was a little bit of a stretch, that one. So
I'd say make lots of games, share them with people, find a community of people that also make games, and share them with them, and then share them more widely. That's kind of what we did. We started this weird festival called Come Out and Play, which was a bunch of outdoor games, and you wouldn't have thought it would lead to much, but it did. It got a lot of attention. People came and had fun, and then a community built around it.
Yeah. I think we've seen here a lot of different routes to similar places, not quite the same for everybody, but similar. And I think all of you in the chat can pull that yourselves. I want to get one lightning round question in really quick because we have some questions in chat that I want to start answering as well. But before that, one lightning round question. So in one sentence, what is something that you would give as advice for someone getting started in the industry? So not necessarily based on your own experience. It can be on anything, any general advice for someone getting started in one sentence.
Get really good at networking. It's probably like the biggest cheat you could have. Like if you're able to talk to somebody and of course, like not make it in a what can I get out of you sort of way, but genuinely create connections, like make people feel listened to and that they're interested in you and you're interested in them and what they're doing. Obviously outside from like actual talent and having actual skill, it's like the third, technically speaking, you don't actually even need those first two. If you know the right people to get you to the right places at the right opportunity, like half it is luck and half it is skill. So networking is huge.
I'll say take care of yourself. As someone who's self-employed, as someone who is a, full-time creative, it's very easy to, feel the pressure or need to work through weekends, to never stop checking your email, to, always be on. But the fact of the matter is, crunch can only take you so far. And there will be a time that you burn out. So making sure that if you want to make a career of this, making sure that you are taking care of yourself and your communities, whether that's friends, family, neighbors, etc. Make sure that you're feeding yourself, taking care of your mind and body. Because otherwise, if you're not enjoying life, you're not going to be able to make something that players enjoy.
Yeah, Ben kind of stole my number one, so I'm going to go with my number two, which is don't get attached to an idea. It's very easy to get fixated on a single idea and really hold on to it and not be open to other things. And one of the biggest things that I see new designers doing is they'll get attached to an idea and not be able to take feedback or be able to let go of something if it doesn't work or if it's not doing what they need. So don't be precious with your ideas. Be willing to throw something away if it's not working.
I'd say as a small studio that has to make our own games and promote them, get good at promoting them. Making games is like the first quarter of making something, and then you got to let the world know and find an audience.
All right. Let's jump into our next section, which we're going to talk a little bit about some of the different parts of working in the games industry. And it can look really different, as everyone here has probably already picked up on based on how everyone got started and where we ended up from that. We're going to talk a little bit about studios and about the differences between different studios. We have a lot of people here with very different relationships to studios, some who run small studios, some who work for bigger ones, and some who work on contract or who do things more individually. So with that said, I'd love to ask all of you, what do you think are the biggest differences between smaller studios and bigger studios, indie, AAA? What do you think are some of the most notable differences? From a designer's perspective.
Let me jump in there to start us off, because I've worked in quite a large studio, but also on projects with very small teams and large teams. And one of the big differences is the amount of different roles that you're going to end up doing depending on how large the team size is. So I worked on a team with only 3 people on the project, and in that project I was the only designer and did almost everything that wasn't really hardcore programming. And I've worked on larger teams where I literally did just one element of something. So at the time I was doing just data integration. So I was just moving something someone else had designed into the tools so that the game would work. So I wasn't even doing design. I was literally shuffling information from one document into another document so that the game could read the information. So you can go from doing just one very, very narrow thing that you do that and you do it very, very well, to you do absolutely everything.
Yeah. I only technically have experience with bigger studios for sure. I've heard a little bit about how small studios can work, and I think I very much agree where it's like the smaller the studio that you're working with, usually the more hands you'll have in different pies. When it came to me working with EA, again, I had a lot of experience again working with much smaller, more personal, just groups of people that I want to make games with. And those I had to, I was doing sound engineering, I was doing my writing focus, I was any programming that I could manage, which not many, but some things that I'm not stupid enough to be unable to do. But then when I was able to get into that first professional job, a lot of that work then became much more specialized. I was hired on for a particular purpose. If I noticed things or if I wanted to try to reach out to do other kinds of work, it was possible, but it was a lot harder because not only did I have so much on my plate, again, working for a bigger studio, you're usually just going to have a lot more to do. You're making a bigger game, you have more expectations placed on you for whatever that particular thing that you're brought on is. So I might see problems that I could try to help solve, or I might see new parts of the project being picked up by other people, and I'd be like, wow, that's really cool, like I really want to be on that part, and then they'd just be like, oh, but I have to write 100 character bios and develop 500,000 ability names for different things, so I really just don't have the time in an 8-hour day to actually like go out there. So yeah, I think that was like the biggest change I noticed as well.
Something that's kind of an element of both of those is just the level of oversight you have. So when you're working on a large team, you're going to generally have like bosses, managers, or if you're working on like a licensed property, you might have, shareholders, etc. And a lot of people not only telling you like, hey, this is what the game is supposed to be, but also you're going to have a lot of people giving you deadlines, telling you what they expect you to finish within a fixed amount of time. One of the hard things about being self-employed is that I love not having a boss. Like I love that I can set my own hours. There are a lot of things that I really like about it, but it's very hard to set your own deadlines. It's very, my biggest deadline is rent. I make sure that I have games out in time to pay my bills, or I make sure that I have a game out before a big trade convention that I'm going to be running a table at and hand selling games to people. So with a larger organization, you're going to have more oversight. You're going to have more people telling you what to do, but also you're going to have more people like clarifying those expectations for you. And we've also talked about like a lot of different education backgrounds, a lot of different career paths, the same way that like, there's no right path for education to becoming a game designer. Some people are self-motivated enough that no one could stop them from making games. Some people, they're like, all right, if I don't have like someone giving me a deadline and I know that I'll get a failing grade if I don't complete this, I'm never going to finish it. It's the same thing with like where you're going to thrive as a game designer. Are you the kind of person that like, hey, it's worth it to you and you have the intrinsic interior motivation to wear all the hats yourself and to be able to keep yourself on a schedule? Or, is it sometimes worth that lack of freedom to be able to do work you care about and not have to worry about all of those extra things, and instead, be part of a team where you can work under someone and maybe someday be that person who's setting expectations for others?
That was all very well said. I don't think I could add anything to any of those.
All right, very humble from Greg, but let's jump into our next question then. This is again talking about differences in working in design. This is a little more specific though. So what kinds of design work do you all like to do? What problems do you like to tackle? What kinds of, or not what kinds of, but what parts of games do you find the most interest working in? Because games are even smaller games, pretty complex little creatures. So let's talk about which parts of those we find the most interesting.
Coming from a literary background, I'm a real sucker for something I call mechanic as metaphor. So one of the fun things about tabletop role-playing games is that it's often very physical, very tangible. There are games that like there are a lot more people playing games over Skype and things like that, and that can have its own joys and challenges. But I really like a game that kind of goes beyond the dice and thinks, what other ways can we tell stories with the tools around us? A favorite game of mine is one by Epadiah Ravachol called Dread, where instead of dice, you have a Jenga tower. And as characters make decisions, you pull tiles out of that tower. The idea of the game being that it's a horror game. You're being pursued by some kind of monster or serial killer, something like that. And, as you're trying to escape, as you're taking these actions, the tower is going to get more and more precarious. It's going to get closer to falling with every choice that you make. And so the themes of the game, a tense game, where something could go wrong, there could be disaster at any time, is mirrored in the mechanics of the game itself. So I really like thinking about that design challenge of, I mentioned a candle earlier, of okay, what kind of game can you design around a tea candle? What kind of game can you design, just using cardboard coasters around the house? And is it going to be a game that is well, I'm going to use dice because everybody uses dice? Or are you going to make something that's hey, this game is special because it uses this specific material and tells stories in this specific way, and, marrying the design to the content of the game itself so that you find something that's, unique. And even if it's just a small little experience, maybe it's one that people haven't had before, or that helps them think about things in a different way by telling a story using something they're already familiar with from other games or everyday life.
I just want to add on literally to that answer. There's a tabletop RPG that I played a long time ago. Easily my favorite experience, maybe by far, just in games, called Sign. Where
Sign is wonderful.
Sign is insanely good. In fact, just super quick synopsis. Basically, you're playing as a child in a home for the deaf, basically, and it's about how people can create language and create community even when technically you're not as hearing aided people, we don't necessarily understand or even comprehend how that could possibly be possible. And that game perfectly encaptures that sort of same idea of taking something that's small and easily recognizable but not very well understood or not very well thought about, and still finding ways to just totally turn it into a unifying gaming experience. That is not to sound like a broken record probably for this talk and for the rest of my life, but it's exactly the kind of stuff I love doing with narrative, finding ways to meld narrative and a story and character motivations with something like a game mechanic. I think one of the earliest ones that I ever ran into that really got me hooked into a game was Telltale's original The Walking Dead series. There's a very simple mechanic. It's hardly even a mechanic if you're really thinking about it. When you're playing the game, you're just oh, it's just the thing that happens. But if you talk to a character in the game, there will be a little text prompt on the top right side of the screen that just says, this character will remember that you said that. Super simple. It's not, it's not running, it's not jumping. It's just the game telling you that your actions have consequences and that it will be remembered. And that simple change really changes the way that I personally played the game. And I know many other people who've also played those games as well. We're just oh, okay, well, I need to be way more careful. I can't just, I don't know what will happen in the future if I let this one character go off into that zombie infested area. This isn't an action game. This is survival at this point. Finding ways to really engage players emotionally into what they're doing, whether it's through characters, whether it's through tone or through story or through the world itself and the environment they're actually walking through. I find that to be the really engaging stuff that I love to dig into. When I'm playing games or when I'm making games, it's that's the thing that gets me.
Yeah, on my side, it's complete flip side of that. I have sort of fallen in love with data-driven design and really plugging into the numbers of what is going on, collecting information and understanding the psychology of why something is happening. So looking into collecting information from my game and seeing the data that I get back and trying to find out why, let's say, if we're talking about the very start of a game, if I see that players maybe stop at a certain step or skip something, trying to understand the psychology of what's going on in my players' minds, why that is happening, and how I can adjust something or make a change to try and influence that and improve it. So let's say your tutorial, maybe I said something and people didn't understand it and they went off and found the shiny thing in the corner, or maybe I made the barrel red instead of green and everybody started shooting it expecting it to explode, or this kind of thing. So I've really kind of fallen in love over the years, and it's something that I have taught myself over the years as I've designed games that have required it, and it's something that's sort of become more part of the design flow over the years as well.
For me, I love making, my favorite thing to do design wise is make games where I get to watch people play them. That's why we make a lot of physical and social games. It's I don't know, more than the mechanics, I'm always just fascinated by the sort of chaos of what happens when
I don't know. Well, we'll have Greg continue that thought in just a moment. Greg, you said the chaos that happens when. I'd love to hear when that chaos happens.
Yeah, so whenever we can make a game that makes more chaos, gets people to throw stuff or argue or whatever, And that's sort of my sweet design spot.
I think all some very interesting areas.
If I can make one comment real quick, I think it's interesting that like a lot of those kind of circle around player expectations and either like, you know, like the fun of like identifying player expectations and being able to like really work within those, or, you know, frustrating expectations of like introducing chaos or saying like, you might not expect a computer player to remember this. But like, I think it's just great that, you know, for 4 designers, all of us, like, our favorite parts of games is just people playing them.
Yeah, and for those of you watching in, I hope you feel the same way, because odds are if you make something and you enjoy people interacting with it and either subverting their expectations or acting exactly as they think it should, and you enjoy that experience, odds are that you're going to enjoy making more games. So you're in the right spot if you're listening and you're thinking, oh, I agree with what these people are saying. With that said, we have only so long left in the call. I want to take one more student question. This is not a direct read, but there was a question earlier on technology being used to fill gaps between different sizes of studios. And I'm going to spin that a little bit if it's all right with the student who suggested it. And I'd like to ask all of you about common tools that you use in design. That can be technology, so that can be software that you use or mechanical like technology that you use, but it could also be design frameworks. So schools of thought that you like to take, or certain structures that you like to use in your games. So for everyone here, what are some tools that we use in design? What do we find impactful or useful?
I'll start and say that one of the biggest things that the pandemic taught me is just how many people play tabletop role-playing games, storytelling games online. You know, for a while there, it was because of necessity. For a lot of people, it still is. But, you know, there are also people that like, you know, they make friends online and they want to play these games with them, and coming together and meeting in a living room isn't an option. So a really fantastic tool for me is things like Zoom, things like Skype. You know, when I have a game, you know, I play test it online in addition to my physical play testing to make sure it works. And for some of those games, you know, I design alternate rule sets to make sure that they can work for people. So, for example, I have a dice stacking game called Hounds, where you stack 6-sided die until the tower falls over, and then you read the results like tea leaves. Now, you can't stack those dice online unless you have like a virtual tabletop or something. So a big challenge for me was coming up with a mechanic that was still satisfying, that still fit the themes of the game and the goals of the game, but also didn't require you to have dice in front of you. And another thing that I learned because of that experience was that in designing games to be online and video call accessible, I wound up designing them to be more capital A accessible for people with different ability levels as well. It's very easy to forget when you get excited about a game stacking dice that not everyone has, you know, the dexterity to stack dice. Maybe their hands shake, you know, maybe it's hard for them to reach the table. You know, there are any number, maybe it's just like a stressful situation for them. I think that thinking about different ways that people might play your games is really important. And one of the best ways to do that is to engage with the actual platforms that people might play your game on, whether it's a virtual tabletop or, you know, something kind of thrown together with rubber bands and string. I'll also just say that there's a website called, I think it's Any% or Any Dice. It just tells you probabilities. When you have people rolling like D6s and stuff a lot, it can be helpful to know like, oh, how often will a 7 come up? Like if I say that this thing only happens when someone rolls a 1, how many times will that actually probably happen during a game?
I can sort of build off your probability, which is one of my most common tools, and one that was never taught in any of the game design courses that I ever went to was Excel. It's something that I use every single day constantly, and you can very easily make a chart that shows you all of those percentages very quickly in Excel. regardless of how big your table or how many dice or how many numbers or sides on that dice is. For example, a deck of cards is essentially just another dice. It just has 52 or 54 sides to it. But the one I did want to bring up is that going back to paper is probably the biggest tool that I have for trying to communicate with the team and with other people. Just being able to scribble, to take notes when you're in meetings, to be able to draw if you want to communicate an idea that you have in your mind, being able to just scribble it down on paper to someone beside you is probably one of the most important things that I use every day. And you'll see pretty much every designer that I've ever worked with has a notebook on them almost all the time, permanently, just taking notes, scribbling, showing other people, hey, do it like this, draw a random scribble that shows arrows pointing from one thing to another. So yeah, and you could do this in a computer program, but oftentimes the computer program adds a layer of complexity that makes it a lot more difficult to do when it's a lot easier on paper. So probably the best alternative to that would be one of the newer sort of tablet style things where it is essentially the same as paper, but you have the benefit of being able to save and organize it on your computer as well.
I'll second the paper thing. We do everything on paper, cardboard, just paper part.
I think we got another Wi-Fi spike from Greg. Oh, there we go. Yeah, you were saying paper, cardboard.
Yeah, just I mean that's you play it, you make something down and dirty quick. You learn so much about the game and what players want. That's our big tool.
Yeah, Nick and Greg both took my answer, unfortunately. Paper is like the most cracked, the best thing ever. Obviously, I'm a writer, so that's probably where a lot of the bias comes in. But something about like having the analog of actually writing down your ideas, I feel always helps me remember them more or think about them better. I guess like maybe like as you're creating it on paper than versus writing it on something like like a notepad online. I will say like as maybe like a secondary to that, something that is really useful that I found helpful for specifically designing things has been the term might not be correct, but whiteboarding effectively. So like being able to think about spatially where players will begin in terms of a design and where this core idea will then lead them to the next idea or the next mechanic, and then from there on and so forth. So you can see like these resources build into this mechanic, and this mechanic relies on these other things like happening around it. So you can physically see like, okay, like where are the complexities, like where might there actually be problems that players can run into. Do I want it to be so that this is like a more end game style aspect to the game, or do I want to bring it more close to the forefront so that players can get into it faster, because this is kind of where the fun of the game is. And then of course whiteboarding at the same time allows you to share it more easily, so you can more easily say, hey, like teammate, this is what I'm looking at right now, like what do you think about it? Honestly probably goes very similar along the lines of paper, but it's more for like blocking out your background mechanic type work.
All right. There's a bunch more questions that we had. There's a bunch of student questions as well that we weren't able to get to. We will be doing more of these career talks. We'll be doing them in design and art and all these different areas. So stay tuned for that. Before we wrap up, because we are just out of time, if there's anything that our guests would like to speak on, anything they've been doing recently or want to share with our listening students or watching students, excuse me, then feel free to share whatever you've been working on or anything like that. Or anything you might find interesting too. Even if you don't have a project you want to share, feel free to share another project you think is worth some attention right now.
Yeah, so I'll say that you can find all of the work that I do at www.possibleworldsgames.com. You'll find all of my projects there, as well as contact information. If you have any questions, the more specific, the better, because it is hard to like juggle all the time to make sure that everything goes out. Feel free to reach out. This industry thrives on like lifting each other up and offering, like advice and anecdotes when possible. But to that end, I would also just encourage people, to get online, find people who enjoy the kind of games that you want to make, that enjoy the kind of games you want to play, join a Discord, find like even just an after school club, go to your local library, see who's talking about the things that you like, and start, sharing your ideas, playing each other's games. The best thing you can do as a designer is play as many games as possible and get your games in front of as many people as possible. Even if you're making single player games, that doesn't mean that you need to or should isolate.
To Tyler's point really quickly, for students of Endless Studios, for apprentices working in our programs, feel free to keep an eye on our website over the next few months. We might have some developments there that people who are interested in doing what Tyler is suggesting there might also find interesting. So keep an eye on the Endless Studios website.
I did want to build on what Tyler mentioned, that just in addition to going and playing games, go and play games you don't play usually. So play something that you've never played before that is different to something that you usually play. If you usually play Fortnite, go and play a game on a table with a set of dice, or go and play a game in the courtyard, play some hopscotch, or go and play a game on your mobile device that is like a strategy game, so you can broaden your idea of what is possible in a game and sort of what the common uses in other types of games are, instead of just having the things that you like are the only games you play.
Yeah.
Really quick, Nick, do you have anywhere that people can reach out to you, or do you have anything you want to share on that end?
So I don't typically use any of the kind of usual social elements. I am on LinkedIn, and I will pretty much only reply to someone if you send me a message saying where you've met me and a little introduction. But on that note, do go out and reach out to people. We are real people, so don't be afraid to send a message to someone who designed your favorite game, who is a designer. Go find them on whatever platform you can, send them a message and say, hey, I played your game, I loved it, I'm looking to design, and just start a conversation. It's probably one of the best things you can do to start your networking and start building up connections inside the games industry.
Just also don't be offended if they don't reply.
Yes.
Like everyone has lives, and, measure your expectations, but like, if you're sending a message to someone that the thrust of it is like, hey, I admire what you do. If you have the room, can you answer this question? Even if they don't have the room, they're going to appreciate hearing that like you admire them enough to ask, for their advice.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. I'm also similarly not too totally on social media. If you find me on LinkedIn, easiest place to reach out to me for sure. Happy to answer and talk to people, which happens rarely, but really does happen, and I always appreciate it. So I have no problems answering questions. I think on the same line as what everybody else has said so far. Not only to just explore and play games, and to just like try to engage with the industry and with your own sort of like sense of like what you find interesting as much as possible, but try to do some thinking for what you want out of a career. There's a lot of different ways to make games, a lot, far more than I expected when I was going into college, and far more than I even learned then. I've only, as I've grown, learned more and more ways to see how the people are making games, how people are working within the realm of games, but not necessarily even playing them or making them themselves. it might be possible that there's an avenue out there that's not the most direct, most obvious avenue that you haven't heard about or you haven't seen yet. And that's actually the one that really starts to call out to you as you start to look into it more and more. So just try to look around and see what is available, what's out there. Obviously, if you already have an interest, perfect, then dig into that. But if you just sort of feel like you want to be in games but you don't know, then also that's totally fine. Just try to explore as much as you can.
Yeah, my website's giganticmechanic.com. You can reach out to me there. And yeah, I agree. Email people. People are always happy to talk, usually. I know I always am. It's always fun. So yeah, feel free to reach out. And I would say, I to second the
One last little Wi-Fi spike to end off the stream there.
Yeah.
Greg, can you say that one more time?
Yeah, make lots of games. Make sure you like making games more than you like playing them.
I think that's a great note for us to wrap on. Well, everyone, it was a pleasure. Thank you all our guests. Thank you for everyone watching. We will be doing more of these talks, so stay tuned for when we drop the date for our next career talk. But until then, I hope you all have a lovely night. And for those of you that, or for everyone actually, hope you have a happy new year. Bye, everyone.
See you.
See ya.